This first question comes from Gary. Why wasn't Saul impressed with the evidence? Apologists claim the evidence for the resurrection is very strong, yet Saul had access to all the evidence and all the eyewitnesses for 3 years. He wasn't convinced until he had a, quote, heavenly vision. Why should educated non-Christians today trust apologists' claims that the evidence is strong if Saul and the overwhelming majority of first-century Jews found it insufficient?
Well, it's not clear to me that the overwhelming majority of first-century Jews were giving it an even-handed assessment, first of all. Okay, according to the record, Jesus was crucified because the Jewish leadership whipped the crowd into a frenzy before Pilate to ask for Barabbas rather than Jesus. And that's just one example. And the text says that Pilate understood it was through envy. But we have a lot of other examples that are mentioned in the text that anybody who would show favor to Jesus would be thrown out of the synagogue. Okay, mm-hmm. So even Nicodemus in John chapter 3, one of the most respected leaders of that group, came to Jesus by night to have a conversation with him and acknowledged, he said, nobody could do the works that you do unless God had done them. So I think what this question does is it underestimates the impact of peer pressure. Mm-hmm. Especially when the peer pressure is a bullying pressure that is in a position to place a penalty on those who don't agree with what they want to agree with. Okay, so all of that makes it disincentivizes people for looking at the details. Okay, closely. Secondly. Saul's not the biggest mystery. The biggest mystery is the Jewish leadership who knew that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead.
I just put a note down. Yeah.
That's the resurrection of Lazarus, the raising of Lazarus is in John 11, but in John 12 talks about they were plotting to kill Jesus because he had worked such a notable miracle. A lot of people were following him now based on the miracle. This is even before the resurrection of Jesus. And then it says, and they also plotted to kill Lazarus because Lazarus is the living, breathing evidence that Jesus raised him from the dead. Now, this is like a no-duh, right? Really? Are you kidding me? But this is what I call unbelievable unbelief. And so it tells us, and this is true even now, even with the preponderance of evidence, people have motivations for not accepting what's obvious, all right? And so there's a psychological element here that is not being acknowledged by the challenger, the questioner here, Gary. And I don't know if Gary's the one who's asking the question for himself or he's offered it, but this is the kind of question an atheist would ask. Well, if the evidence is really that good, why didn't Saul believe? The answer is, I can't get into Saul's head. I don't know why Saul didn't believe what was obvious, if in fact he had the evidence of all of the same kind of evidence that everybody else had. Remember, he was told that the Jews stole the body, that the disciples stole the body, and that was probably good enough for him. That was the rumor or the explanation that the Jewish leadership put out. I don't know what was in his head. The question isn't what was in Saul's head if the evidence is so good. The question is the evidence any good? Mm-hmm. And when you have an empty tomb, when you have the sightings, when you have the conversions, when you have the origin of the early church, for example, when you have clearly Jesus was executed on that Roman cross, and you have these things that are not disputed, the question is what best explains all of that, all of those data points. And there is no explanation that is offered that collectively explains everything except the explanation of the apostles, he was dead, is now alive. Okay? Now, if the evidence is so good, why wasn't Paul convinced until later? It is interesting. He was convinced against his will, as it were. That itself is a data point. But why wasn't he convinced beforehand? I don't know. It doesn't matter. You have all kinds of things that people believe that there's plenty of good evidence for that counters their belief. There's still some flat earthers. There are geocentrists around. So my point is this, to the naysayers, to the heliocentrists, to the people who actually think the earth is a globe. If the evidence were so good, then why aren't these people believing? Do you see what a nonsense question that is?
Mm-hmm.
It takes you nowhere. It takes you nowhere. What you have to do is look at the evidence, not at whether or not people believe, and ask whether the evidence is compelling. If you don't think it's compelling, then don't believe. But you can't disqualify the evidence because somebody else didn't believe. You don't know their psychological circumstances, but we do know from the record a lot of the social pressures that were around it. By the way, even though the majority of the Jews didn't believe, all of the early church, almost entirely up until first century, were Jewish, including skeptics like James and hostile persecutors of Christians like Saul of Tarsus. So I mean, I don't understand. I guess I don't understand why someone would think that this point, based on the question, is somehow compelling to them.
And I think a good question is, why would the church grow at all in Jerusalem, where people had the ability to see the evidence? Why would it grow at all? And it did grow very quickly.
That's right.
If the evidence was bad. That's another question you can ask.
Listen, there were lots of individuals in the first century that claimed to be the Messiah. And just before that, you can go and look at the record if people are interested in that. There were lots of people that rose up. Even Gamaliel is made a statement about that. You know, when he said, "Let this go. If it's not of God, it'll die. It'll die a natural death," which all the other ones did. What is it different about this particular one? And even somebody like Bart Ehrman acknowledges that the testimony of the resurrection of Jesus goes back very, very early. This is not invented. I mean, even in the book of Romans, chapter 1, first couple verses, declared with power to be the Son of God through the resurrection. So there you got, what is Romans, like mid-50s? You've got, within 20 years, you've got a declaration of Jesus as the Son of God based on the declaration that he rose from the dead. So this is not a later addition in the record that as time goes on, people are just adding stuff to it. I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons why this doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, this is just a poor line of reasoning. Now, that doesn't make our view true, but it makes this kind of objection silly.
Well, and I think the Lazarus point is so important because here they're saying he raised him from the dead, so now we must kill him so people don't follow Jesus.
Right.
So just knowing that a miracle happened didn't change their hearts towards Jesus. Mm-hmm. And you talked about psychological and social reasons. There's also spiritual reasons. You know, people, they don't want to admit that they have sins. They want to be self-righteous. There are all sorts of reasons that the Pharisees, they wanted power. Mm-hmm. They had all sorts of reasons to not follow Jesus. You know, Paul's the same. He said he had everything. He had arrived. He was a Jew of Jews, and he was a Pharisee, and he had all of these advantages in society. Mm-hmm. So there are all sorts of reasons why people wouldn't want to follow, even if they think it's true. They can offer a different explanation for it, like mm-hmm. the Pharisees did. For example, when he drove out demons, they claimed it was because he did it through Satan. So right. You can even interpret the evidence you're seeing in a different way if you're against that person.
To which, by the way, Jesus had a great rejoinder. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I mean, obviously, that's worked its way into the to the vernacular of the English language. It's so well known. Now, somebody might say, "Well, you're just trusting that the Gospels say this about Jesus and Lazarus and the Jews and everything." Yeah, well, that's the same text that you're relying on to say that Gamaliel, or rather that Saul of Tarsus, wasn't convinced until he had allegedly seen Jesus. Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't seize upon a historical text as historical to make your argument, and then when the counter is offered from the same historical text, dismiss the historical text. This happens all the time, though. All the time, people do this kind of thing.
So I've one little story to illustrate this, because I've encountered this myself. I used to have Mormon missionaries coming to visit me every week, and we would talk about things, and they switched them out, so I talked to a bunch of different ones. And one time there was,
switched them out.
Well, they're always moving around, so I don't think that was because of me. But so one of them, I asked him, I said, if I were to convince you for sure that the Mormon Church was not true, would you follow the truth or would you follow the church? And he sat there for a second and thought about it, and he said, I'd go with the church. Mm-hmm. And that just shows you the power of the social pressure.
Yeah.
Your family, your friends, everyone has these expectations of you. You don't want to lose your standing in the community. There are a lot of reasons. We see that throughout the New Testament.
Right.
You see people walking away from Jesus for those very reasons. So it happens. Mm-hmm. It happens. And he was very open about what he valued more than the truth.
Right. By the way, that's a question that Frank Turek, when he visits the various universities, I was with him last week for CIA, and this week he's at 2 different universities, making his case. But he asks this question a lot as people are pressing him. He said, if I could persuade you that Jesus was who he claimed to be, would you follow him? No. Okay, well, why? What's the point of asking?
I always like to ask that question because I think it gets to the heart of the problem, and that is they don't like the biblical God. They wouldn't follow him even if they thought he was real. So the problem isn't the lack of evidence. The problem is, who do they think God is, and why do they hate them? Right? Hate him. So that's a great question to ask.